Hello, this is Catherine from Accelerated Reader, reading books for you. Today, I will be reading Two Very Rare Bears, chapters 13 and 14, by S.P. Bullock and G.S. Before I begin reading, I would like to give a big thanks to the authors for sending me this book to read on my channel. In the description below, I've included links where you find and purchase this book. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 13. The next morning, back at Pendle Farm, Emily and James were tucking into their porridge. Grandma was making almond tarts, and Grandpa had just come in from feeding the alpacas and horses. "Where are Eva and Tom?" said Grandpa. "That's strange. They're usually the first ones down in the morning." "Eva! Tom!" Grandpa called up the stairs. "Coming!" shouted Eva. "Just a minute," said Tom. Eva had snuck back into Tom's room where Tom, Eva, and Harry had come up with a plan. Harry would sit in Tom's wheelchair. It was the perfect way for Harry to travel without attracting any attention. Nobody would question a young boy having a toy with him, and Harry could then see and hear everything that was going on, as Eva and Tom were about to ask their grandparents for a trip to London. So, with Harry tucked into the side of Tom's wheelchair, they made their way down to breakfast. But as they approached the table, James, who by now had finished his breakfast, jumped up as quick as a flash and grabbed Harry by his left ear and started spinning him around the kitchen, shrieking with laughter. "Stop! Stop!" shouted Tom. "No!" screamed Eva, desperately trying to grab James. "You don't understand." Harry's head was spinning. Just then, James threw Harry across the table towards Emily. She caught him by his left leg, jumped up, and ran outside into the cold December air. Grandma turned around. "What's all the commotion?" she said. James bolted out of the door after Emily, followed closely by Eva and Tom, who was desperately trying to get his chair out of the kitchen quickly. "What's going on?" shouted Grandpa. "Why is everyone outside? It's freezing cold. Nobody even has a coat on." What a time for Emily and James to play catch with Harry, thought Tom, who by now was outside too. "Morning!" shouted Andy. Tom whizzed past him in his wheelchair on the path, almost knocking him over. "Sorry!" shouted Tom, heading straight towards the alpaca enclosure, where by now the other children were playing. Emily and James were tossing Harry around like a rag doll. He was flying through the air. Eva was jumping up, shrieking at them to stop, and trying to catch him. Suddenly, Emily ran and placed Harry on the back of Coco, a large, friendly, apricot-colored alpaca. "Look, he's riding Coco," she cried. Grandpa and Andy had also arrived, and even Grandma was walking up the path carrying an armful of coats. "You'll catch your death out here," she shouted as she came up behind them. But what happened next was a sight no one expected. Coco sat straight down on the ground and stretched out her long neck, and all the other alpacas surrounded her. "Whatever is going on?" said Grandpa. Grandma, who was handing out coats, suddenly stopped too. Everyone, even little James, stopped in their tracks. Then all the alpacas sat down, and just before Grandpa could utter the words, "What the?" the lifeless little doggy bear stood straight up on Coco's back and proceeded to walk gently up her neck and onto her ears, then down her nose, before softly jumping onto the ground and patting her on the top of her head to say thank you. Everyone stood open-mouthed. No one could believe what they were seeing. "Everybody, this is Harry. We were just about to tell you before James and Emily ruined it all," said Tom. Eva shouted over to Harry. "Are you okay, Harry? You could have hurt him," she said to Emily and James. James burst into tears. "I didn't know," said James. But Harry was just fine. He left Coco's side and walked up to each alpaca and tenderly placed his paw on each of their heads, as if to thank them for not panicking. He then walked towards everybody and said, "Hello, everyone. My name is Harry. Sorry for all of the commotion. I don't mean to cause any problems for anyone. I just want to find my brother George." "But you came in a Churchill's Christmas hamper," said Grandpa, scarcely believing he was having a conversation with a small brown doggy bear. "Yes," said Tom. "His brother George is still in Churchill's toy department." "Well, we hope he is," said Eva. "That's what we were about to ask you," said Tom. "We need to go to London," said Harry. "Yes," said Tom. "We have to go to London and find George." Emily was staring at Harry with her mouth wide open. "Are you really real?" she said, still confused. Harry nodded and walked over to Emily, who now carefully took his little paw in her hand. "Wow, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize," she said, feeling bad about throwing him around. "This is a lot to take in," said Grandma, who was comforting James, who had just about stopped sobbing, as he hated it when Eva shouted at him. "I think we should all go back inside, where it's warm. I'll make a nice pot of tea, and we can talk about what we are going to do. I can't think straight. It's so cold out here." Everyone agreed and walked back to the warm house. The alpacas went back to their alpaca business, and Harry climbed up onto Tom's chair. "I think that went quite well," said Harry, as Tom wheeled himself up the path and inside the house. Grandma put the kettle on the stove and took her now burnt almond tarts from the oven. Then, still in shock, everyone sat around the table, including Andy, and started firing questions about Harry. "Stop, stop," said Eva. "Harry will tell you everything, but you all need to be quiet and listen." Everyone stopped talking, and Harry told them his story, starting on the Wen Shu and ending at Pendle Farm. When he had finished, Tom said, "So, you see, we must get to London. It's his only chance of finding his brother, George." "We could stay with Auntie Maggie," said Eva. "She could take us to Churchill's." Grandma and Grandpa looked at each other, bemused as to what to do. But then they smiled, as they had not seen Tom this enthusiastic and engaged with the others in ages. "Okay," said Grandpa. "What the heck? It's Christmas. Let's make a plan." "Yippee!" cried Tom, hugging Harry. "I told you it would be okay." "Right. We'd better call Auntie Maggie," said Grandma, "and we need to keep Harry a secret." "Your wheelchair is the perfect hiding place, Tom," said Emily. "He can travel with you easily without anyone noticing." Everyone agreed. Chapter 14. The phone rang several times in Auntie Maggie's hallway. She was slow to answer as she was brushing Queenie, her latest rescue cat. Maggie now had 7 cats. Poppy and Amber were her oldest, 2 fluffy Persians. Poppy was a friendly and affectionate girl who usually was found asleep on her favorite chair. Her sister Amber was more aloof and she often disappeared for the day on an adventure around the neighborhood. Keith was a skittish Devon Rex who loved company and a warm lap due to his lack of fur. Elvis was a big black and white tuxedo who was friends with everyone, even the vet. Little Jack was a lively and bossy short hair, and Pip was a yowling Siamese who thought he was human. Queenie made an extraordinary noise as she purred like a regular cat, but also cooed like a pigeon. "Hello," said Auntie Maggie as she picked up the phone. "It's your mother," said Grandma. "The children would like an impromptu visit to London before Christmas, and they wondered if we could all stay." "Oh, of course," said Maggie. She always enjoyed the company. "I have a new cat, and I'm dying for you to meet her. She's adorable." "Oh, excellent. We too have someone for you to meet, but we'll tell you more when we get there." "How lovely," said Maggie. "I have plenty of room, as you know. You're all welcome. I'll go make some beds for you. When are you coming?" Tomorrow? We also need to go to Churchill's, particularly the toy department." "Fabulous. I love a trip to Churchill's," said Maggie, never fazed by anything. "Are you enjoying your hamper?" "Oh, yes," said Grandma. "It's been remarkable." "Oh, I know their produce is divine," cooed Maggie. Maggie was a well-known character around where she lived in Hampstead. She made a living reading palms and tarot cards, and since the loss of her beloved sister and her husband Nick, the children's parents, she had recently been studying Reiki and healing using crystals. She had a large, rambling, and eccentric house. Her ex-husband, a scoundrel of a fellow, left her when he eloped with a young model. Maggie never met another man, and had filled her life with good friends, her, rescue cats, and paraphernalia from antique and charity shops. She loved to reuse and recycle. Her house was an Aladdin's cave of trinkets and unusual goods. She had a particularly liking for toys, and her kitchen shelf was a tribute to old and lost ones, some with only one arm or an eyeball missing. The children always loved a trip to Auntie Maggie's, but this time it was even more exciting. "Wait until Auntie Maggie meets Harry," said Eva. "She won't believe it." "None of her toys can talk," said James, and Eva chuckled. Harry was excited. From a position of total despair, he now had a family and helped to find George. Grandpa had booked 6 train tickets to London's King's Cross. Andy offered to stay and look after the farm, as someone needed to feed the alpacas, horses, and Grandpa's newly acquired pot-bellied pigs, Hendrix and Biggie. Grandma was upstairs, helping the children pack a small bag each. Emily was busy trying her doll's clothes on Harry, as she was worried that he would catch a cold. She'd settled on some blue trousers and a small green top. Harry wasn't quite sure, but didn't want to hurt her feelings, so went along with it. Harry looked hilarious, dressed up in doll's clothes for his trip to London. "There you look lovely," said Emily, "and you won't get cold now." Tom was bubbling over with excitement. At last, he was about to have a real adventure, one that was going to include his entire family. The next morning at 9 a.m., a small minibus from Brown's Taxis, a local company that provided wheelchair-accessible transport, arrived at Pendle Farm. The driver was Steve Brown, the company's owner. He was a cheerful chap who was surprised to see the entire family, including a small doggy bear, all ready to go. "Blimey, you're all eager," said Steve. Harry was nestled into Tom's lap, They were indeed eager. It was a race against time if they were to find George. The children had hardly slept all night. They were too excited. They just wanted to get going. Grandma had prepared a large packed lunch for everyone. Grandpa helped Steve load the bags, while Eva helped Tom wheel himself up the ramp and into the back of the minibus, and before they knew it, they were off. Steve and the family chatted the entire 50-minute journey to Leeds station. "Last-minute Christmas shopping trip to London?" said Steve. "We are going to see our Auntie Maggie," said Emily. "And we are going to Churchill's," cried James. "Now that's a shop to see at Christmas," said Steve. "We'll have a good time, and be sure to say hello to the Queen for me," he said as he dropped them off at the busy station. As Steve drove off, Tom looked at Harry. "Here we go," he said, holding his little paw. Grandma collected the tickets, and Eva wheeled Tom, followed by the others as they all headed to the platform. It was full of people, all excited about the upcoming Christmas celebrations, traveling to different locations. Their train, the 11:03 to King's Cross, was on time, and they waited until they could board, and they were the first on. The children were so excited they were finding it difficult to sit still. Tom had a special place, which was reserved for wheelchair users, and the rest of the family had seats around him. Harry hadn't moved a muscle so as not to draw any attention. Once the train was full and everyone settled down, the whistle blew, and with a slight judder, they were off. As the train chugged along, all four children talked excitedly. Harry sat on Tom's knee, smiling up at him. He was so excited. He was actually on his way to find George. The carriage was full except for 2 seats next to Grandma and Grandpa, which were reserved for Grantham. Everyone was starting to feel hungry, and Grandma handed out some delicious homemade sandwiches and drinks. The children eagerly tucked in as the other passengers looked over enviously as they peeled back the plastic of their pale, insipid, shop-bought snacks. After eating, everyone started to feel weary, and there was a general lull in the carriage. Grandpa had nodded off, gently rocked by the train. Grandma was doing a Sudoku puzzle, and all 4 children were quietly staring out of the window. Even James, who was barely ever silent, was falling asleep, probably due to the fact they had not slept much the night before. All the excitement was catching up with them, but not Harry. He was wide awake and praying George would still be in Churchill's toy department. "Next stop, Grantham," came the announcement. The train rolled into Grantham station, and as the doors opened, a gust of cold air entered the carriage, which woke everyone up. Onto the carriage walked Sam Scotford and his very exhausted-looking mother, Jill. They were passengers of the 2 reserved seats. All 4 children looked over and were shocked by Sam's attire. For, although it was December, he wore only a large black t-shirt bearing the words Mega Mix 2. "Where's Mega Mix 1? said Grandpa, chuckling and winking at Sam and Jill. Sam didn't hear anything as he had his headphones on, listening to his never-ending playlist from his portable music player. His mother Jill smiled and said, "Well, it's not me, that's for sure. He's obsessed with his music. Sam has autism," said Jill. He was reluctant to engage with anyone until he discovered music. It's really brought him out of his shell. He loves to share his music with people and make them mega mixes. He's hoping to be a DJ one day. As the train left the station, all they could hear was the electronic noise emitting from Sam's far too loud headphones, and his mother who kept tapping him, saying, "I'm awfully sorry," and gesturing at Sam to turn it down. "What are you listening to?" said Tom. Sam's mother pulled off his headphones. "This nice young boy is talking to you, Sam." "I'm Tom," said Tom. "What are you listening to?" "Hi, I'm Sam," replied Sam as he held out his hand. Tom reached out and shook it. "This is my sister Eva, my other sister Emily, and my little brother James." "Oh, and this is Harry," Tom said while pointing to Harry, who still sat in the side of his chair. "I'm listening to some of my favorite tunes," said Sam. "Can we listen, please?" said James. Sam smiled. He loved nothing more than sharing his music. "Please," said Emily. "Okay," said Sam. "Let's get the party started." And so, for the rest of the journey, Sam rocked the carriage with his favorite tunes, putting everyone in festive spirit. Harry had perfected the art of acting like a regular stuffed toy, and he sat motionless on Tom's lap. He couldn't believe he was at last on his way to find George. Grandpa occasionally winked at Harry, reassuring him everything was going to be all right, and Tom gently squeezed his paw. And by the time their train reached King's Cross Station, they had all exchanged phone numbers and addresses, and Sam Scotford, Megamix 2, promised to make them their very own Pendle Farm Mega Mix. Stay tuned for chapter 15 and 16. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe. In the description below, I've included links where you may find and purchase this book.